Hey, thank you guys, everyone for coming. Most of you probably know me. I'm Ian Maxwell from the Faculty of the School of Architecture here at DAB. As most of you are aware, I know there's a couple people who don't seem to be in either of the workshops. Over the last, I guess, 5 years, UTS has hosted the Architectural Association Visiting School. And tonight's lecture, it's not only the first lecture in the 2015 lecture series, but it's also, I guess, a lecture that's very much associated with the AA Visiting School. And it's with great pleasure that we have with us this year Brendon Carlin. It's his first trip to Australia, hopefully the first of many, perhaps associated with the AVS or for many other reasons. Brendon is a native of Colorado. I guess he studied architecture and environmental design at the University of Boulder, Colorado. Is that right?
How do you know all this?
I read the fabulous bio that Tom Lee from the AA provided. And Brendon, I guess, has studied and traveled extensively, and in the conversations that we've been having just over the last few days, it's amazing how many places he's been. I don't think there's any continent you're yet to visit, perhaps. He's certainly worked in the UK with Plasma and in China with MAD, and also in the Netherlands with UN Studio. He holds a Master's in Architecture from the Design Research Laboratory at the AA, the post-professional master's degree. And he's now, having taught at places like the Belaga and workshops with the AA programs, visiting schools in China and also at Harvard, is now an intermediate instructor, Intermediate 6, which I guess will probably be spoken about in some part perhaps tonight. But Brendon pretty much divides his time with teaching at the AA and also practice-based research through a studio called Urban Systems Office. And no doubt that work will be part of the lecture tonight. So it's without further ado, I present Brendon and very much look forward to the lecture, and I hope that we can have a robust conversation afterwards. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Thanks a lot to, lower this a bit, yep. Thanks to AA Visiting School, Jeff, for having me here. Also to UTS. For the first part of the presentation, I just want to make an attempt at a kind of post-reflection on the work that I've done as a unit master for the last 4 years at the AA, and also on the practice that I share with Jeroen van der Meijden in London. A lot of these questions are kind of driven by a philosophical reflection after designing some very, very large buildings and a master plan for 100,000 people in China. I'm told our master plan is starting construction within the next year or so. China now is a country where things like cities like this are being built every week, right? 100,000 people. So I think at times during the lecture I'll be kind of criticizing the current status of my own work. So the second part, I'll just show a few projects, some from the office, some from the unit, and a few workshops, other AA visiting schools that I've done. To start, I just want to evoke Tadao Ando to introduce what I think is a kind of absolutely fundamental question that every architect should ask, and that's, what is architecture? And I like the way he phrases it. He says that, I believe, however anarchistic it may sound, it is important to ask the fundamental question, what is architecture? The creation of architecture must be a criticism of the problems of today. It must resist existing conditions. And it's only when one faces up to today's problems that you can really begin to deal with architecture. So I'd like to propose the idea that producing architecture is an inherently political act. And by building form and space in the city, we support established ideologies or the status quo. We stake out space for autonomous action, or we probably do both to certain degrees. And I would propose thinking of architecture in the city as a kind of material framework for society, which emerges from within society, but it also alters the course of society. So I think these, potentially, you may be saying these are extremely basic notions, but I'm kind of arriving at these now again to question where things are going. So I'd say through the organization of material, physical material, as a device that mediates the interrelationships between itself, people, the city, the climate, and the social and cultural context of a place. And I think architecture acts politically in the means by which it mediates interrelationships. So partly because the AAVS is based around Maison Domino, a criticism of Maison Domino perhaps, and I'll present just a few examples of instances where architecture has been used as a political tool as well. And I think throughout history, many of the greatest shifts in architectural style or formal organization have been kind of consciously employed as political devices. So in the post-World War II environment during the Cold War, the United States as a kind of new imperialist power was using architecture as a tool in ways that I've discovered were pretty subversive through a kind of, in this case, through the Hilton hotel chain. So they did this by planting American modernist megaliths in cities of newly independent countries across Africa and the Middle East, and these buildings were literally conceived of as kind of weapons in a fight against the spread of communism. And this quote below is Conrad Hilton, the owner of the chain. He's saying that to show countries exposed to communism the other side of the coin, that they were doing this to show these countries the other side of the coin, the fruits of the kind of free world. So also another example in post-Civil War India, you may know this one, Corbusier did a master plan for Chandigarh. And this was a new city commissioned by the president at the time, Nehru, to promote a kind of secularism, national unity, to give a new identity to the country that transcended the differences between Indians of different religious and ethnic backgrounds. So, and I'd also like to emphasize that it's not just about a symbolism or a style, but it's also about the form and organization of the city to foster a kind of utopic model of socioeconomic life. So the city is actually organized programmatically and spatially to promote a Western liberal model. So on the other end of the political spectrum and a bit earlier, the architectural form and space and language employed in Red Vienna during the 1920s was a framework to foster a kind of new Marxist socialist ideology. And it's been read by Pierre Vittorio Aureli as being a blatant rejection of bourgeoisie ways of living. The Vietnamese superbloc did not propose a new style. However, its radical formal arrangements, reorganization and abundance of collective facilities served to reorganize communal living under a new ideology. And he says that the intention of Carl N. in doing this was also to empower what he saw as a kind of underpowered class within the society. So we were just discussing the other day, and kind of this is a speculation, but I think that if you look at the recent pop-up of different architecture in Georgia, it's not coincidental, right? Georgia was just in a war with Russia recently, and it's recently separated from the USSR. And I think, well, it's been 25 years, let's say, but I would argue that in many cases these buildings carry traces of a Soviet identity, but they smooth and contort them to create a new language as well. So, don't want to recite all these quotes, but this one's nice. So, architecture is political in the way in which, as a space-time sensorium, it organizes being together or apart, the way it defines outside or inside. Architecture is political also in the manner by which it makes the many controversies of reality visible by means of its own spatial and aesthetic syntax, and can enact new spatial and aesthetic formations of sociability from within. So I think that captures quite well what a lot of these examples are doing. Nevertheless, some people and former mentors of mine as well that I've had agreements and disagreements with, and I've appreciated actually Patrick as a critic. I screen captured this off of Facebook before I left London, and it's a pretty bold statement, so we can give him credit for that. But he says architecture is not politics, not art, not science, not engineering. It is the design of communicative spatial form. You can agree or disagree. So I think that the last 15 years has seen the level of sophistication at which we, a kind of young generation of architects, we've been able to put to use a kind of arsenal of generative tools, and we've become very technically advanced. However, in many cases, we lack the foundation for a kind of reflective, critical discourse attached to the work. And for me, this is especially apparent at the urban scale. So this means that we're left wondering, at least for myself, why we're doing what we're doing. And for me, this became a crisis working at the urban scale in China. I think common sense can go very far. The outcomes of a bottom-up kind of emergent process are amazing. But I think a greater education and kind of critical theory needs to be formulated about society's relationship to the built environment. So I'd characterize this as that we're recently growing out of an adolescent fascination with digital computational tools. And they've triggered an easy production of high-resolution architectural mechanisms and evolved modes of testing, simulating, and constructing things. But as Cedric Price puts it, probably quite astutely, technology is the answer, but what is the question? What is the question we're asking ourselves now at this current point? And I think we have an opportunity to revisit and reevaluate fundamental questions which have both recently emerged, but they've also persisted throughout the history of the profession. And I like to reference Etienne Louis Boulet, who began his seminal writing asking the same question: what is architecture? He was the first architectural writer to reply to Vitruvius, and this was, 1,600 years later. I think that was about right, yeah. But saying architecture is not firmitas, utilitas, and venustas, but that the first issue in architecture is neither technical nor aesthetic, but philosophical and ethical. And I think we have to understand the context in which he's saying this. He's living amongst the political upheaval in France at the time. So I believe that architects should always feel a sense of responsibility, especially the people working at this scale in China, let's say, and other places in the world, to consider carefully spatial organization, materiality, fabrication, construction in their work, much as potentially architects in a time of political crisis do. Can we call the situation in China a political crisis? I think you can certainly call it a kind of environmental crisis and a crisis of architecture. So this image for me, it's maybe a bit over the top, but it goes to show that how fundamental the wall is as a form of separation. So this served as an enforcement device and finally as the physical opening for a reconnection. So I'm interested in the idea that of architecture as machines for agonistic struggle, for conceiving of them as sort of frameworks for a productive conflict, negotiation, and emergence of potentially identity and place. And I think that through testing different composition of space and materiality, we can question the status quo and alternative modes of interaction and habitation. And I'm really appreciating these examples, though I wouldn't call them necessarily political. I think they challenge very much the idea of the domestic space, which is a question that we're bringing up a lot in the AA visiting school now. And I think the ideas of Matthias Ungers and that he passed on really to Rem Koolhaas, I think I'd give him credit for that, are still fundamental, and I would argue that they were the last critical reading of what the city is through non-biotechnical kind of terminology. The formal and spatial architectural autonomies are essential to what makes a city, and it makes a city a kind of essential arena for agonistic struggle. I also like to cite the open frameworks of Yona Friedman, Cedric Price, and recently Alejandro Aravena to illustrate the idea that architecture can give autonomy, create conflict, negotiation, evolution of identity, and as he was saying, a mobility unfettered by the historical imposition of politically or economically imposing urban typologies. And I also think it's just fundamental that architecture also has the means to operate politically against a wave of global homogeneity, and this happens probably spontaneously, especially in the case of Wangshu, through a kind of climactic, geographical, and culturally specific responsiveness. And I think this is something that's probably already integrated into a lot of the work that's coming out of the new generation. So the question now, I think, is how do these new sets of tools and technology that we have at our disposal present a set of new opportunities to address some of the questions for understanding and response to a vision of the future for the material fabric of the society we live in. I'm going to show a few projects. The first set of projects, some of these are quite old, and let's say loosely maybe related to that spiel, but the first set of projects I'd like to present are a few workshops that I've been doing at Hook Park as part of the AA visiting school there, which is called Make Lab and is now directed by Jeroen. And just to cite Mr. Quinter, in 1993, our culture is moving decisively away from classical mechanism and reductionism, more specifically the physics model as the system and method of explanation that has dominated our modernity for nearly 5 centuries is giving way to a biological model. This constitutes one of the most dramatic shifts in thought since the Renaissance. So I think potentially to try to frame this, the primary question that we're asking with some of these projects is can implementing new forms of computational fabrication technology set in motion and emergent architectures that respond to event and context in a way that's unachievable through direct human intuitive design? And should the architect operate at the level of system enabler? And this is I would say, potentially a legacy of DRL as well, but framed in a slightly different way. So we did Make Lab 1 in 2011. This is the forest of Hook Park, part of the AA, but located about 4 hours drive away in Dorset in the UK. And the challenge we presented to the students was take the Microsoft Kinect camera, take this custom CNC device, which is a briefcase that can be taken to the forest, and you have 5 days to do something with it. And they hung this this is how it works, in 3 points to be able to move this pointer anywhere in Cartesian space inside of that triangle. No. So they through a bunch of testing models, they started using local timber as a structural material for building a kind of frame. And they designed a simple twist-in eye hook and cable tie system to connect the lengths of the hand-cut timbers. So what they did is they scanned this path for the first day while they were working on some models, and they collected some movement data from the site to generate a point cloud. And then they, through some help of technically skilled people, they translated the variable density point cloud into a 3D Voronoi with triangulated faces with an algorithm, so that the dense areas were kept clear, so that you could still move through this. But there were a higher density threshold on the edge of this path. And there's a little bit of fiddling there, but it was quickly done. The triangulated structure in the design software is described as a series of coordinates in space, and then the 3D, the CNC device points out these points, and the participants just follow it around and basically tie up these nodes. So the amazing thing and the sort of epiphany that happened after the workshop is that no material is pre-cut, measured. You don't need plans to build it, right? You just follow the CNC around and you construct this thing that otherwise to construct precisely would have been a total nightmare. No? So I'll just show a short video if it works. Yeah. This is just the initial, that's actually me in my kitchen calibrating the Connect camera. I think that's still testing scans. This is testing to calibrate the fact of whether we know this thing is working or not. So we take a time-lapse photo and have it follow this path and see if they match. Here's the CNC pointer, some testing. There's that digital that you saw in real space. There's the model. We had to sort the points, obviously, to sequence the construction. Sorry, it's a bit choppy. There's Jeroen and I, a forest or a table wedged into the mud in the forest. Maybe I'll skip ahead. There's a bit more, but. So I think the important aspect of this is partly to recognize that the structure is kind of directly linked to the situation in which it was generated through the system we designed. So it's not a kind of pieced together by hand. But so if we introduce this system into a completely different context or scenario, it would generate a completely different form. And potentially we could introduce it into a much larger scan, and you would get a much bigger structure. So can you expand that to the scale of a bigger building? You know? And then work on the rules to translate how it would manifest into a kind of material outcome, spatial outcome, let's say. I've never been able to explain this successfully because it's quite confusing, but this is the next year of MakeLab. This year we enabled the CNC with an Arduino so that it could respond live to information and weave like a kind of a spider with a set of rules that we give it live in a live response to the Connect camera, which we have hanging in the forest canopy above the site. So what you see at the base is a kind of zone of activity that was monitored again through this forest clearing, and the students came up with some rule sets for weaving to try to create a space that you could still move through, but the goal was to completely encase that space in an enclosure. So someone cleverly pointed out that if we just recognize where the lightest point is in that space after every weaving move, we can then position the next weave to try to cover that point. So this just happens over and over and over and over again, continuously stitching. We're using a really simple clip and blue rope system. And you can see the CNC pointer there. We had to add a really long kind of member to it to be able to get to some of the points because there's a sort of ground to tree to other member pulling sequence. And ideally, we would have gotten, I think, a lot further with this to the point where it became so dense that you could actually read very clearly the space. But this is as far as we got. It was quite a tedious process. But it was really amazing to look at this thing after it was built in the forest because the trees are blowing and you see this thing kind of contorting and stretching in the forest. And maybe it's just symbolic, but I felt like something really had emerged out of that process. So I'll also just talk really briefly about a few projects from the unit. as I described earlier, one of the areas of investigation and curiosity kind of is architecture as a framework, with the architect becoming the designer of an infrastructure instead of a kind of final form to be appropriated by users. So this allows us to expose some fundamental issues architects deal with. And the architect in this case becomes a sort of material policymaker and conflict mediator. And the example I cited earlier was Alejandro Aravena. If you know this project, he did a social housing block in Chile and sort of community meetings. And the idea was that the site was so small, but people still wanted the ability to build out from their house to expand. So they came up with this solution, which I think is extremely elegant. And then you can see a few years down the road that people did expand, and they expanded it in the way that they chose to expand. So I almost see this as a kind of identity generation machine, though in a slightly, let's say, watered down version. At Team 10 conference in 1960, Yona Friedman presented Villa Spatiale, which is a kind of lattice work he had floating above the city of Paris as an infrastructure that could be filled in the same way with housing. So planning rules could be created and recreated within this frame according to the needs of the inhabitants and the residents. And you might also know this project that seems quite fashionable, at least at the AA right now, but I think it's interesting that the ultimate goal of Cedric Price's 1962 Fun Palace was the building that was capable of changing in a kind of constant play with users. So people could actually hold events in here, and the building would modify in order to accommodate different range of events. And this is said to be the model for Centre Pompidou. That it was actually a kind of Rogers and Piano. Rogers and Piano adopted that idea, and I think it got it obviously got constrained quite a bit, but it's still quite clear. So a few examples of the work. We do at AA in the unit system, we have 2 terms. First term is October, basically through the beginning of December. Then we have second term is quite a bit longer, second and third term, 4 months, 5 months, 4.5 months. So this last year, we sent the students out on a sort of reconnaissance mission to follow people around creepily and just kind of map out what they're doing in a public space in London. So this is a behavior mapping that one of the students, Lawrence Berger, did last year. He spent several weeks going back to this place and just trying to make a correlation between the architectural features of the building and the way that people tended to behave in patterns in the place. And he was quite systematic about it, so he ended up finding some weird kind of correlations that were interesting between things like visibility, sunlight, dimensions of space, and what people would tend to do in those spaces. So this is if you know London at all, this is Royal Festival Hall. It's a sort of indoor public building in the city. Anyone can access. There's always open public events there. And just to jump to the end of this kind of 2-month project that he did, he ended up designing a sort of what I call a kind of conflict and negotiation platform for a variety of users that visited the space. And this was an adjustable system of walls with built-in furnitures. And what he was constantly struggling with was how can he protect the rights of these minority users, that do unusual things in the space, but also be able to facilitate larger groups of people, that can, and kind of, it almost became like writing a kind of constitution, a legal constitution through architecture, which was interesting. And then we get to expose what he's really about through that. So last year, John and Sung Bum spent several weeks at the Barbican doing a kind of similar exercise, this time with a bit more environmental consideration, sunlight, wind, but also spatial characteristics, program circulation, to understand how people use the space. And they designed a system, a kind of flexible, let's say, kind of parametric system for variable apertures to create different degrees of light penetration, sizes for social gatherings, or privacy levels. And they use these mappings and flows, patterns on the site to graft the project into the site with the aim of kind of provoking unexpected encounter with the space and in between different people, and just with trying to make people stay longer in the place. It's a terrible rendering, but that's all they had. In 2012, Lara created a system of tri-axial structural components, and these were cast inside of a variable, let's say a customizable variable mold, so they could create a whole different range of components, different lengths of members, different faces, and they built a one-to-one prototype. So this thing actually bottomed out the rental van, getting the cement. Now they lifted the pallet into the back of the van. So it's pretty heavy, but it was quite cool. We had to use a loader to put these on top of each other. So she also studied the typical kind of house in this. We went to Chongqing, China, and she studied the typical house and living condition, started making variations, modifications on that, and then thinking about how she modified the mold and the component to suit creating these types of situations, this housing. She started to go to bigger clusters, look at social space, look at different layers of in-between space, shared space, and also according to some kind of Chinese models in the region, but trying to twist things a bit to provoke slightly different scenarios. So she was doing hundreds of these studies of how you shift blocks around a bit and looking at the way that people can view through and occupy this space. And she starts working, this is actually just for the AAVS guys, this was in Grasshopper. She starts building a model to be able to stack, because she wanted to fit 500 units into a site with by 150 by 150 meters and make sure that the living spaces all received 2 hours of morning and evening sun. So she has a kind of tight set of constraints to this. So the stacking studies also added new opportunities for different types of social space, and she realized that the market street in Chongqing is a kind of central place of public, cultural, and economic activity in the city. So she wanted to capture that kind of quality of this space and circulation, and also amplify it. And she initially ended up looking at the connections in the city, organizing this kind of market space as a series of terraced and interconnected places. And then she started implementing her system, looking at providing a range of different user type accommodation within and around this street. So partly she left some of the frames open so that there could be a sort of a layer of user-driven appropriation, and not everything was completely built out. Last year we went to Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Jamie Keyser spent a week mapping the ways that people claim the in-between space there. It's a really fascinating place. People are, if you know it, people are always in the street. People always have openings to the street. House opens to the street. Shop opens to the street. Everywhere seems like a public, a kind of linear or grid-like public space. People are using the space like that. And he invented a flexible silicone mold. So these plaster bits are actually the result of a mold that in the red, the kind of bigger diagram, there's a silicone, so you can change the angles of the members and cast the molds. So you can achieve a huge range of different variations. And he made these tests from that mold. So this served as a system to be able to create these kind of structures with variable density, porosity, edges. And in this case, he's talking about a kind of completely open framework with nothing. He's not filling in any walls, but he's trying to understand through a series of diagrams how he can create, guide the growth of this thing to guarantee that there will still be a range of social spaces, open places, sunlight, air, certain qualities. So this thing becomes a framework for that. And I would argue, this looks a bit scary actually, but I like the idea so much that I'm willing to show it. Just as a quick comment, I just took a photo before I left London, and this year I think we're asking some really interesting questions. This is the South Bank site in London again. We're working on the second term project in this site now. And we have one student who's, just to tell the background, London is growing really rapidly now. Everything is densifying. There's a lot of housing being added. In this site, which is the most important cultural site in the UK, they're building a lot of new office and housing towers around the site. So with a very pragmatic question, I think we're asking some very serious questions about the city. This student has actually taken a bunch of cultural projects from different architects, also taken a bunch of projects like shopping malls and casinos, commercial types of projects that will also likely go around the city. And he's trying to see if you put them all in the same site, what does this mean for the city? And he's kind of a bit evil in the sentiment. He thinks that, at least for me, he thinks that that consumption is culture. It doesn't matter that we have sort of open public spaces or cultural programs. All we need is the kind of shopping mall. So we're throwing all of this stuff into the place. And what we're really interested in is the interface between these things. How do you deal with an interface between cultural program and these kind of big commercial programs in a really dense scenario? This is the office location. We're right in front of the Shard. That's obviously Tower Bridge, London Bridge there. We won a competition about three and a half years ago to design a 4 square kilometer master plan in central China. This is the one I was talking about. It's with the local architects now, and it looks like they're going to start putting the infrastructure in pretty soon. Obviously, I consider this an enormously kind of important task, and it has heavy ethical implications. Amongst the range of issues I think we deal with that are quite pragmatic, there's also the issue that I think is important, which is this issue of urban homogeneity in China. I think that there's the infrastructure as well as the architecture seems to be culturally and socially unsustainable, and I think it's quite destructive to the potential of what the Chinese city can be. There's also a clear challenge in the social segregations that are part of the Chinese urban fabric. There's always walls around everything, always gates around everything. The city is quite fragmented. And I understand that this is a kind of culturally ingrained thing, and it's probably not going to change, but we're trying to work with the diagram ways of working with weaving networks and thickening ground to understand how we can challenge this a bit. There's also obviously the consideration of the quality of the human habitat, and I'm using this literally and figuratively to say that the way that they design buildings there with consideration to how people, the quality that people experience is pretty much like this. It can be described like this. So 500 million people will move to the Chinese city in the next 15 years. You can imagine the scale of this project is quite insane. And I'll just present quickly 2 projects that we've done inside of the master plan. I don't want to present the master plan because I want to change it right now. So I think it has some great aspects, but needs a bit of reflection. Just to describe the workflow in the office, so you have an understanding of where this stuff is coming from when I show it. We work in generative models, so we work with Grasshopper to create all of the components of a building that are over a scale of 1 to 50, basically. And we work that through to BIM, to Revit, and we output the drawing sets from that within this loop. And the great thing about this loop is that the consultant or the client can say, change it. We can change it in the source model, and about 15 hours later, we have a new drawing set, right? So whereas when a client used to come to you or an engineer used to come to you and say, change it, it would be a nightmare. It takes forever to do that. I think the benefit of this to the architecture is that we can test many more things. We can work much faster. We can achieve higher quality of work somehow. So to describe this project, the first step we took was to arrange the massing of these two towers. We have quite a constrained brief, if you can imagine, but to avoid self-shading and to avoid shading around the surrounding site. We look at program organization, and we sort of actually dynamically code that based on the relationships that we think the program should have to each other and to the site. This project is an office tower on the right, the tall tower, hotel on the left, and the bridge with fitness center, restaurants, and the plinth has shopping, restaurants, ballroom, conference center. So within the master plan, if you see that major intersection, it's highlighted in yellow. So we didn't want the building to formally, we want to keep this idea of the building kind of welcoming in the city. So we looked at the major connections, and we wanted to create a central civic space inside of the building. That's what drives the first step of this model there. And then what you're seeing here in blue and yellow lines is the viewing vectors to important places in the city, and the sun vectors during the winter, December 21st, at sections on each floor. So these are used to drive a mapping and placement of voids and winter gardens in the building. And if you notice the cutting through the plinth, that's also, we're looking at obviously organizing the void and the circulation in the plinth to create so that the geometry of the building is shading during the summer when the sun is overhead, and letting light through the building in the winter. And the result of the space is actually quite nice, and we can kind of modify that result through the code, through the way that we interpret the code. So what you're seeing here is a mapping of the view values. We start giving them values to abstract and simplify, and light intensities, and we're mapping in a series of atrium spaces and winter gardens. Obviously, as the views and light values increase, not necessarily light, but at least height in the building, the value of the floor plate increases. So there's a bit more freedom to add more winter gardens in that space. So there are a lot of small private winter gardens. But as we go down and throughout the entire height of the tower, we have 4 floor and 2 floor atrium spaces. And these can be used by all offices on multiple levels. So the idea is to create a communal winter garden, and this is intended to become a space for encounter and interaction within the building. So we studied a range of activity types to drive the dimensions and locations of these winter garden spaces. I recognize that these may not be used in this way, but we're trying to kind of create a sort of narrative that gives an actual, a finer kind of definition to how the building can be used. And we're mapping different types of those different types of winter gardens you can see being sort of placed within the building in this way. So just a quick environmental comment. We're working with a facade engineer in Beijing now to try to work out this double skin system. We may or may not get there, and we may have to add some kind of louver element to shade, because this is it needs to be considered carefully. And I just like to show this because you can see one of the planters in the floor package there. This is the DD set for the project. I was going to show this video. One of the amazing things that we've done with this project is that we're working with Buro Happold in Beijing. And what we've done is we've been working back and forth with them to create a sort of, what they're doing is they're trying to optimize the structure for the tower. And they're using Grasshopper and an evolutionary solver, which is basically creating random variations, testing them for fitness, and the most successful ones are repopulated, tested, mutated a bit, and tested again. So hopefully we come up with a highly intelligent and efficient solution. And the issue that necessitates this is if the tower didn't have any of these kind of structural porosities, you would just run a very symmetrical system over the building. But we have a bridge, we have a linked tower, and we have big openings that don't have any structure. So the thing needs to be quite carefully calibrated. So we gave them a few rule sets. You can change size of columns, or you can subdivide an 8.4 by 8.4 meter grid cell so they can split it up. So they've integrated those rules and they allow those things to happen. That's why you're seeing different densities of structure and you're seeing different colors. There's different thicknesses of members and different density of subdivision there. So here you're seeing a view from the central. These are quite commercial, obviously, because we're dealing with a Chinese client who loves this stuff. I like it too. It's good. But this is looking from one of the main roads, and we actually have a kind of, this is the master plan. We have a ground that's dipping. It's very hard to see in here, but we have a central kind of plaza here, and the ground is actually going below the road and stretching off in a few different directions. And above, where you can see this plaza a little bit more, down here. So we also designed a mall across the street, which you can see the sort of long shape in the background. And there's a large pedestrian network that grafts into the entire city to connect every one of the blocks with a moped network and a pedestrian network. So that's what you see, the giant staircase is actually that pedestrian network, and this is the only moment where it has to go above the road, but it goes into the mall and directly through the mall right there. So that will also go into the other neighborhoods, and we're hoping if they keep building, they keep continuing this network of connections. It's a sort of linear park. Instead of doing park, which is a series of disconnected moments, we do a linear park to give a different alternative means of occupying and moving around the city. That's the central space. These are from, I think, draft conceptual, so don't mind the structure on the roof. And this is or the facade. And this is the bridge with the pool and the fitness center, restaurants across on the other side of the bridge, looking from some office spaces above. And just one more project I'll show. We just completed this, a conceptual phase for this project, I guess a month ago or something. And we're starting with the SD phase now. This is a 200-meter office tower with a mixed-use plinth, which includes a hypermarket and a cinema. And what I was describing earlier with this evolutionary solver process, we actually were using that to test different variations on this building, and that's what you see. This is actually the cover of the booklet that we submitted to the client. But there's a whole series of different iterations that were being tested. And the way we started this project was actually to write a sort of essay about the history of office space. And in the last 150 years, the office space has evolved into a range of different types, which are suited to different industries and company structure. But even though they're very different and they've evolved to meet different demands, we found some correlations in the features and the evolution, which are consistent across all of the examples. And let's say, to really simplify what it is, we would characterize that with the idea of profit per square meter as a performance criteria, and not necessarily people per square meter, no? So this has to do with the happiness of the worker, the levels of innovation they're putting out depending on the company type, and the amount of time they stay, things like that. So if you increase productivity, innovation, and therefore you increase profit, and that's what we're looking at in that trend. This is a really ugly presentation because I didn't have enough time. I took this directly from a thrown together client presentation. Didn't have enough time to kind of work it out. Sorry about that. But if you read Chinese, it's great, I guess. Just illustrating to them what some examples. The left is the Victory Center in Baltimore in the U.S. And obviously they're trying to pack as many people into this space. And we were looking at these companies that use these different models. And in this particular company, the worker productivity was very low. This is a historic model that a study was done on. There's frequent turnover, frequent vacancy, and short-term tenancy eventually in the building. So The model on the right is McGuire Group investment banker's office, and this company, because of the architecture, basically has an extremely low turnover rate. They were occupying a building like the Victory Center earlier. They achieved 30% greater productivity over their previous office space, and yeah, it was. So we proposed a series of bundled tubes, and these tubes can shift in section and position, and they can also scale throughout the height of the tower to accommodate different qualities. We propose a split core configuration. So the core is actually, it's a tri-axial or a sort of what do you call it, tripod split core, 3 cores, and one of them drops off. So you're seeing one of the upper floor plans to the right, where the low-rise core is not in there anymore. And on those levels, you have we achieve an 83% efficiency, which maybe not that interesting to you, but we're telling to the client. Sales pitch. This split core arrangement allowed us to create internal voids which bring light into the heart of the building, obviously. They frame views out over the city. We're looking at oblique angles with creating these openings. So these openings not only cut through the building, they shift the tubes and scale the tubes through the generative model. And we have a set of diagrams that drives the behavior of the building as we modify things. And you can see to the top, as we have 2 tubes slightly coming apart, we create a sort of interstitial space opportunity between partitioning. And as we go further, that's when you create these sort of void spaces. So it's like this stretchy space that gets broken. Yeah, so we're just trying to integrate these features that have been proven to boost the kind of productivity and efficiency in the building. And obviously, one of the characteristics that's really important is for us to create this kind of visual connection, communication across from office to office. In a one office per floor scenario, or in an office that occupies multiple floors, they can use internal stairs through the void to connect the office space. You don't have to use the lift. And they have open view to the entire office, let's say, from different points. So in a multi-office scenario, several companies can occupy the same floor, and sort of hopefully we use these spaces to kind of cross-fertilize a bit. So one of the primary drivers was also to think about the visibility of this building, because it becomes an important landmark for the client in the city. And we started making a generative model based on these desires and needs. So advertising for the cinema, visibility for the tower, also the bank needs a good visibility. That one's changed because obviously it's not working that well here. We wanted to, the hypermarket is the key anchor program, as we call it. So we want to pull flows of people past other retail shops and programs that can feed off of that activity, that traffic. And we want to, because the central plaza of the city is just to the southwest corner, we want to use the system of bundled tubes to kind of open up the building on the ground floor and try to create a sort of continuity of that public space into the building. We lifted the cinema to get more advertising potential. Again, we're looking at a central kind of civic space, hopefully inside of the building, and calibrating that with the sun angles. Creating other opportunities for creating terraces and things by the way that we manipulate the behavior of the geometry, and we're actually sucking in the geometry around the tubes to create the entryways with canopies and obvious communication of where the entry is. Sorry, I'm talking about something you can't see back here, no? And that reverses in some places to get a sort of terracing situation which can be used by some of the program. So the retail program is occupying the legs of the tower and feeding off of that traffic that feeds through the building into the anchor programs here. The office, we have a quite efficient office floor plate that's taking up probably 60% of the tower, but then the top is a bit more spacious and yeah, flip through this. So we proposed a diagonal crosswalk from that plaza, and we're also opening up these legs now a bit more, trying to figure out how we can get that to work with all of the constraints, so that we get a kind of clear view and pathway in through the tower there. And this is looking into the kind of central plaza space inside of the building here. Yeah, back at the hypermarket, we're looking kind of from the lobby, exit of the lobby of the tower into that space. Sky lounge on the roof. That's the Communist Party building to the left. I don't know what that means, but what's that? Yeah. Oh, ouch. I hope not. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, sorry, I think I showed this already, but that's one of the interior spaces, and this is not quite the right angle, but a lot of these spaces kind of, they cut through oblique angles, and they sort of frame places in the city, like the kind of central civic plaza. Yeah, we use this quote sometimes just partly because Churchill said it at the AA, but there's no doubt whatever about the influence of architecture and structure upon human character and action. We make our buildings and afterwards they make us. They regulate the course of our lives. So put those questions up there for you guys because I think it's pretty critical. No? Think about it for a few days and then see if you have the same opinion about what you do. Thanks, guys. Yeah. Do you guys want to, you can ask questions if anyone has.
Yeah, it's just, I think I got the microphone. Yeah, it's working. I guess it's an opportune time to take some questions from the floor if anyone has some, especially from our students. I think it's great that you've been on the other end of the AA panel. Does anyone want to challenge, ask a question?
Did you say challenge?
Anybody?
Go ahead, Maxi.
So this is impossibly awkward, of course, because as the kind of host, I'm compelled now to ask a question, but obviously I left for the middle with my kid. So hopefully one of my colleagues.
Great lecture, very enjoyable. Most of your work's in China. I'm wondering what other markets you are also pursuing, and if you think that some of the ways that you're generating your projects would be relevant in any other context.
Well, pursuing anyone that'll take. Obviously with some criticality towards the client themselves, because the client that we have for these projects is obviously a great client that they'll allow us to do work like this, where you can see that there are a lot of what you said earlier, a lot of redundancies that become what we think are amazing for the architecture, you know, as well as the efficiencies. In a different context, I think that's, yeah, I see what position you're putting me in. I think a lot of the, let's say, the lessons learned and the kind of, to the certain degree, the open-endedness of the processes, you know, of the systems that we use, I think it can be quite effective in different contexts, you know. But I think maybe there would be a lot of considerations for modifying the way that they work, you know, and maybe even aesthetic considerations. You know, the obvious ones are that, yeah, you modify the the kind of nature of the thing according to circulation, light, views, surrounding buildings, but also as a sort of like a political context. Maybe there's something else that needs to happen. Yeah, so I think they can be used though. Yeah, I think so.
I mean, I think it's interesting that China it's in some ways it's almost like a negative, right? That you choose China to work in, but at the same time, China is one of the only places that has an appetite and a willingness to experiment at these levels, I think, as well. I don't think this work is really possible in more established building economies because of the kind of the attitude or the baggage or the heritage, if you will, of those people. So I think it's a double-edged sword. At one level, we can lament that they might want to build too quickly and too often from a render and not from a more executed drawing that took a little bit longer. But at the same time, I mean, it is, as you say, there's 100,000 city every week going up, and there is an appetite for these things, which is really interesting. I just wanted to, I mean, I think it's fantastic that you guys are mixing, I guess, practice-based research, teaching, and work. I wanted to ask you, what is the importance, I guess, of maintaining a relationship with teaching, and what are the kind of consequences for that? I mean, obviously there's time consequences, but what are the other aspirations or motivations for doing that?
I don't ever want to stop teaching. I think it's absolutely critical to remain in parallel with practice. Well, yeah, I guess I like what, I think, who said this? Maybe it was even, I guess it was Brett saying it about Eisenman and Koolhaas in the this AA publication, Conversations, right? He was saying that he's kind of sort of comparing the commonalities and differences between the two, and one of the similarities was that they used teaching as a way to test some of their ideas. And I think, on one hand, I find myself trying to kind of find a healthy balance between just freely fostering the student in certain directions, and at the same time trying to use that as an arena for pushing ideas or studies that you can't really, are way too provocative for a practice, no? And so I think that's really important, yeah. And I think the exposure, I have to say, the exposure at a place like the AA to the other tutors is absolutely essential, because they confuse the hell out of me all the time, no? I mean, there's a lot of weird stuff going on, a lot of interesting things being asked, and it's always pushing your brain, your sort of the elasticity of your mind to kind of think about other issues. So I think that's really important, yeah.
I suppose referring to the context in which you framed the whole lecture, which I enjoyed. The first tower you showed, which was the office, hotel, commercial lower ground with the bridge connection.
Oh, that project, yep.
Yeah. So my question is, how does that go beyond or reinforce the sort of political status quo within that context of buildings that scale?
Well, I think, I would call the statements that I made earlier on a bit a sort of retroactive reflection. Those are probably synonyms. But maybe that makes it doubly effective. I think that there's always that drive in the projects to challenge the kind of social boundaries that exist. The question for me is, how do you do that through form, and how do you do that in a way that cannot be corrupted through form? And maybe that's naive, but I think it's an interesting line of inquiry. And I mean, I think we did try to do that to some extent. The master plan is really trying to create a sort of network for all people through all places, and including, well, not all places, but all, especially in the center of the city. This building in particular, it tries to not create a boundary or wall. I think, China, like I was saying, China's all about walls, and those walls don't manifest as walls anymore, but they manifest as giant barriers to people being able to access certain types of buildings and things. So I think the idea of trying to create means of access through the building and create ways that make them very visible, very clear, hopefully open it up to more penetration somehow. But otherwise, I guess like I was saying, maybe in terms of how we just organize the interior space of the building is really important as a kind of more conscious principle. That instead of just, and this is the reason why the client is so great, and is that maybe we can actually provide a bunch of communal spaces within the tower that everyone can access, right? Even and this might drive up the cost of the building, so it kills itself in the end, but that's the hope. Yeah, so, but I think the question that I'm posing in the earlier part of the lecture is really, needs to take it to a completely different level, and I'm kind of asking how we can do that. Yeah.
Okay, so if there's no more questions from the floor, I would just like to thank Brendon again. I think It's great that in a student audience, especially, that you can, these kinds of retroactive, reflective considerations of the work and where you're at, and this kind of almost public expression of some of the anxieties you have is fantastic. Because I think I mean, obviously you're at a point in your career which is beyond what obviously our students are at, but at the same time there's similarities which obviously they're going through, and I think that's amazingly generous of you to do, and I thank you for that. And if we could all put our hands together and thank Brendon for his